Hello everyone and welcome. I'm Naveen Agarwal. This video is a recording of an interactive Q&A session we just had very recently on the topic of risk management for medical devices. Now, risk management continues to be a challenging topic, even for those of us who have been in the industry for many years. So the intent behind these interactive Q&As is to engage in a conversation, in a dialogue. And sure enough, we had a very engaging conversation about certain topics related to risk management. And this is not going to be the only Q&A session. We will have more in the future. So you can watch the entire video at leisure. It's about an hour long. Or you can follow the time-stamped links as part of this video to scroll forward to a question of interest. So I want to invite you to take a look at it. And I hope you will enjoy and learn something new. If there are more questions, please let me know. And I look forward to meeting you again on our future interactive Q&As. Okay, well, everybody, welcome all. So we will dig into this, but I think I wanted to start with you to give you a little bit of perspective based on some of the things that I was thinking about lately and how it touches our lives in a real way. You know, as everybody knows, we are going through COVID. And we have hundreds of COVID diagnostics tests now available in the market, right? I have made a lot of videos on those, and guess the highest watched video that I have relates to false positive test results. Now you wonder about that. A lot of people are wondering about accuracy of these diagnostic tests, false positives, false negatives. And on that account, recently FDA actually issued a safety communication related to one specific test that does RT-PCR. And I thought, why would they single out one test? Is there anything particularly wrong with that? And I checked into the data, whatever, adverse events reporting is going on, not much. And in fact, I got very curious. There are many other tests and literally over 1,000 reports of inaccurate tests or inadequate tests or false positives, false negatives have been reported to the FDA. So think about that. If you get a false negative result, that is pretty high risk, right? In the time of COVID. And we wonder about it because you do all you can in your design and development to articulate the risks and control them, but you don't know everything. Things happen in the marketplace, and that's why we have this post-market surveillance closed loop feedback. And this is one area where I think particularly people are going to find a lot of challenges. Those who are relatively new to the field, because it is being beefed up in the current version of 14971. And also EU MDR will have very strict requirements around post-market surveillance. So what I want us to remember is, above all, why we are doing this. Now, I know about audits and inspections and regulatory requirements, very important. In my mind, you must do them regardless. So this discussion that I like to have in this forum is less about regulatory requirements, but more about how to actually do them right by the patient and by our business, both. We got to make sure our business runs effectively and efficiently, but we also want to make sure that our patients are safe, right? Regulatory compliance is a given. We got to have that. So I talk less about how to achieve regulatory compliance, although those questions are welcome. If you have struggling on a piece that is bothering you, how I get this done and satisfy my auditors potentially. But I really like to emphasize that let's talk about getting this done, how we can actually operationalize risk management. So I just wanted to give you this perspective that we have to think bigger. And a lot of people have asked about pFMEA already. Right? pFMEA is a tool, but I want us to and we'll talk about that. I want us to take a step back and say, why are we doing it in the first place? And how I can make it work efficiently and effectively for my business. Those are things that are of interest to me, and I hope they are of interest to you. So I'll stop here. And I know we talked about pFMEA. If anybody wants to articulate a question, if not, I will just talk about pFMEAs in general first. But if you want to articulate a specific question, please feel free to do so. You can also, by the way, use the chat box in your on your screen to share comments or questions that come up as we talk. You're welcome to do that. So I'll pause a little bit and see if anybody has a very specific question about pFMEAs. No? Okay. So if not, what I heard you guys say is that the major difficulty we face is how to connect our FMEAs, whether it's pFMEA or design FMEA or something else, to our hazard analysis. How do we connect it? That's what I heard from all of you. So to that, what I say is, number one, let's first really understand what we mean by hazards and how hazards link or lead to harm. That connectivity, I believe, that understanding of that connectivity is limited. In my experience, I've seen a limited understanding of that connectivity, and I emphasize on that. As an engineer, we always, and I'm an engineer by training, so as an engineer, I know we emphasize understanding of failures. What leads to failures? Okay, we do a very good job, but I know, Erin, you are the sole representative from the medical safety side, and I'll tell you, it wasn't until I started working with medical safety colleagues that I fully understood their view of harms and how patients get harmed. And very rarely do they talk about how things fail. So we are living in two worlds. Engineers are living in the world of failures and controlling those failures, and medical safety people are living in the world of patient safety and hazardous situations and hazards that lead to those scenarios where a doctor has to intervene to make something happen before the patient gets hurt. They understand what's happening in the real world. Engineers are saying, what if? What if it fails? So engineers are like that. So it wasn't until we started working together that I felt we had an understanding of hazards, hazardous situations, and harm. So number one, I will say, yes, worry about the pFMEA, but first worry about a good understanding of hazards, hazardous situations, and harms applicable to the product that you are making. Okay, I call that hazard analysis, and we'll talk about that a little bit more on hazard analysis. But once you have this, once you have a good understanding, now you begin to see a clearer picture. And failures, device failures or software failures are only one part of that. You'll probably spend a lot of time, and you should, to design products and softwares and whatever you are doing, which are inherently safe, which is number one, risk control, right? So that what I say is that use that for the purpose it is designed. It is designed to control failures and improve reliability. Do not force fit a failure mode effects analysis for hazard analysis. Do not put a round peg in a square hole or the other way around, whatever, however you want to call it. Let's do something that makes sense. So what I like to tell people is think of a bridge document that allow you to bridge your engineering risk analysis with hazard analysis. Now, what it looks for you may be totally different. Okay, and I have a lot of experience helping people integrating the two. And integration really is the right word, because we don't want to substitute a hazard analysis with failure modes effects analysis. That's what most people do, and they find themselves in a lot of trouble. The reason being that the failure modes effects analysis, FMEA, is a line-by-line tool, is a single failure tool. And single failures, typically in the real world, things happen by a combination of effects, not by, single line item. Even if you have a single contributing factor for device failure, that's only a trigger event for what will happen next. Before going from failure or a trigger event to patient harm is a big gap. And in our mind, it is squeezed because we go from here to here in a second. And that's where we need to talk to medical safety people and fully understand what is happening. So on purpose, I'm not going to tell you how exactly to integrate the two because it depends on your situation. But in principle, I want us to understand, do not try to force fit an FMEA into a hazard analysis. You will be very frustrated if you try to do that. But I'm not asking you to change your FMEA, okay? I'm not asking you to make any changes to that. I'm asking you to think about how you will figure out a way to connect those failures, which are potentially trigger points, into hazardous situations, which are a result of sequence of events, and those hazardous situations leading. You have a lot more work to do after the FMEA, okay? So I'll stop here. I know I gave you a lot of overall conceptual description of this, but I want to pause and see if you guys have any questions or comments about that.
From from my perspective, Naveen, this is Ben Higgett. We align exactly with what you said. When we were building our software to support this sort of thing, we looked and saw the disjoint between trying to force an FMEA to be a risk tool. And so understanding how to bridge those two things together, and whether it's a pFMEA or a dFMEA or any other FMEAs that are being performed, the same task needs to happen, where you have that transition between what is a reliability issue to understanding when that reliability can cause ultimately a harm, and being able to bring all of that information together in a way where you don't lose that connection between understanding that the failure was ultimately the trigger for the harm, but being able to separate out the assessment of the reliability from the assessment of the risk is absolutely key.
Well, reliability is, I would say, Ben, you are right. Reliability is a foundation. That's why we are in business. We don't want our products to fail in the market. As engineers, we have to do all we can to have as good a reliability as possible and continue improving. But that's not enough to secure the safety of our patients. And that's what ISO 14971 is talking about. It's not saying don't use FMEA. Do it well. Get reliability. But what they're asking us to do is to think broadly and truly understand what leads to patient harm. And for that, there is no substitute for talking to medical safety people. So I'm so glad that I had a chance to work with medical safety folks in my career, and it opened my eyes. And a partnership between quality and medical safety, in my mind, is absolutely essential for a company to do risk management well. So enough said. We'll talk about FMEA a lot, okay, in these sessions. I don't want this to be the only topic, and I do want to move to some of the submitted questions. So I have a list, but Erin, since you're on, I would pick on you and have you ask your question. You had some good questions.
Sure. Thank you. So this does get into a little bit more of the nitty gritty, I think, of the hazard analysis. So if please feel free to stop me if we need to elaborate on some of these questions. But the first thing I wanted to get your opinion, others' opinions on, is when we are trying to assign a severity ranking to a harm. I've tried to do a lot of research, trying to get some feedback from whatever's out there on the internet. But the predicament is that as a clinician, I could almost link any harm that a patient suffers to a death. If you take it down a pathway and you say, the stars are in line and everything wrong happens, ultimately, a little cut on the toe could cause someone to die. But obviously that's not going to be practical if you have, your highest severity. Let's just say our highest severity is like a 5. If you assign every hazardous situation and harm combination to a severity 5. So trying to get an understanding of when is something really truly resulting in death or causing or contributing to death, or when do you cut it off at maybe it's more of a life-threatening critical situation.
Thank you. That's a great question. Anybody wants to share if they're having the same predicament, how they do severity analysis? Anybody?
I'll happily speak again. I can't necessarily answer your question, but I've had a similar question come up in my dealings and with looking into things, and not only how you would necessarily grade a harm, but looking at things like asymptomatic harms, and as a result of the standard of care that might be available in one area to another area, and then also your patient demographics. So and that particular patient resilience to a particular thing. So is an electric shock, for example, to a young, sprightly 20-year-old, is an electric shock of the same magnitude to an elderly patient that might have a pacemaker, the likelihood is that severity is going to be a lot worse. And I haven't seen anything in 14971 that really helps me understand how I compartmentalize those different sets of information. I don't see a way of breaking that down quite yet.
Yep. It is challenging. I'll agree with you. And I'll just throw this out. Do you guys use this 1 to 5 scale for severities typically in your risk assessments? I see lot of heads nodding. And you have a range from, going from really bad stuff at 5, including death, versus, some non-medical harms, probably non-medical events at 1, something like that, right? And in between. And you define in qualitative terms, definitions or terms and things like that. So there are a couple of points I will make here. And again, These are not kind of prescriptions. These are just ideas for you to think about. First, addressing the issue of death. You are right, Aaron. If you extrapolate any single event that happens to a patient, could be potentially resulting into that. So what I advise people to think about is you need to consider the standard of care, okay, which is outside the domain of your product. But there's a reason why we have standard of care in the marketplace. You don't control it, you rely on it, and our whole system relies on it. If we didn't have this, but it's very important to keep in mind for a global company, your products may go to different areas of the world with different standards of care. Where does the standard of care begin? To make sure that not everything gets extrapolated to that. Where does your part end? And that is highly dependent on the standard of care. A cut in the toe. Reasonable expectation is that people will go see a doctor, get it all stitched up, maybe bandaged and treated. But if not, it could get infected. It could result into systemic infection and death, yes, or amputation. But we don't live in a world without standard of care, do we? Right? We are not selling into a world where there's no standard of care. So we must acknowledge that and write that in your risk assessment or risk plan or risk policy, whatever. What standard of care are you going to rely on? Even pacemakers, even life-saving devices, we are not, as manufacturers, we are not the endpoint. The endpoint is the standard of care. So it's very important for us to articulate how much of that standard of care we're going to rely on. What is our vulnerability and exposure? Maybe we design for the most conservative, like in different parts of the world. But every part of the world has a standard of care. We are not living in, a world where there's no medical care, right? So that's number one. Having said that, even with standard of care, there might be a very high association between contributing factors from your device and death. Quite possible. Even if you have 99% reliability, 99.9% reliability, that 0.1% may still be high enough or relevant enough to directly be linked to death. Under those scenarios, I advise people to recognize death as an explicit category. Only under those scenarios, not otherwise. The reason I say this is because if you pick death, and having said that, yes, everything can lead to that, but you have to make a judgment and assumptions. If it's not like a one-to-one correlation between device and death, which, sometimes it's possible to make, sometimes it's not, and you use death, explicitly death, as one of your categories, guess what you're doing? If you're scale 1 to 5, you immediately lost 20% of the resolution in the severity scale. Because maybe it's not very relevant for you. So what I try to say, people, think of life-threatening, imminent life-threatening scenarios as your highest severity, including death. Don't exclude it, but don't limit it only to death, because there will be two problems. One is you lose resolution, and second, anything that is remotely connected to death will automatically be a 5, and you will be left to answer the question, how do I justify risk acceptability for death, right? That's the bottom line. How many deaths are acceptable? Right? What's the probability of occurrence of death that I will treat as acceptable, or will I always be in red? That's a regulatory compliance problem. If you cannot define properly, then people are going to ask you, it's red. What did you do? How are you controlling it? So do not isolate the highest category to death unless you have a very strong reason to do so. I would say that. If not, it is better to use terminology like life-threatening situation or imminent, life-threatening where death could be imminent. And those scenarios, you could have an acceptable tolerance level for some level of probability of occurrence. You could consider that. So that's how I tell people. Third thing I would say, guys, is try to move away from qualitative descriptors of severity levels. You will get into a lot of trouble. People use like critical, minor, major. Well, something that is minor to somebody may be very critical to me. My perception of risk may be totally influenced by my experiences and what I know. So try not to use those. And if you end up using it, try to define them well. One of the things that I have done, and I wrote an article about this, is a new thing that is coming up, and it's on FDA's radar, called Clavian-Dindo scale. And it's I can send you guys a link after the seminar, after this Q&A. Clavian-Dindo. It's stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4, stage 5. Very outcome focused from a medical point. It's done by doctors. Outcome focused, not necessarily talking about a qualitative descriptor. So those are some of the things you can do. Think broadly, define them well, and try to stay away from qualitative descriptors. Emphasize again, leave this to the medical people. Do not let the engineers assign severity levels to different conditions. Talk to the medical folks and say, what medical conditions should we be worried about for our product within the geographies that we serve, given the standard of care that we have? How are we going to articulate it? So there's no cookie cutter. The more you think about it, the better you will be. Does this make sense, or I went into too much into the weeds with you? Please give me some feedback. Does this make sense, Aaron?
Yes. Yeah, it was very helpful. I think definitely some good points to consider. And yeah, I know that there's no way to say, this is how you do it, this is the cookie cutter way, but helpful points. Thank you.
Yeah, so don't use death as 5 if you don't have a strong reason to do so. Use life-threatening is good enough, right? Life-threatening within, it includes imminent risk. Imminent risk. I like the word imminent. Imminent implies a sense of urgency and element of time.
I also thought it was very helpful and important to kind of set the stage when you sit down with your team so that you're all thinking. So I liked what you said about being outcome focused and determining the medical conditions that your particular product impacts, because then everyone kind of comes with the same understanding of severity, I guess. So I think that was really helpful.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else? What else are you guys thinking about? What other questions?
One of the questions that I have is, usually your FMEA, your pFMEA is also linked to your control plan. Mm-hmm. But I'm not really sure which one comes first. I guess it's your FMEA and then you build your control plan, but I'm not really sure how to put a control plan in place. Like, what are the things that you should pull out of your FMEA to build that?
Great question. And what I would like us to start thinking about is that these tools not being sequential anymore. I would like us to think about these tools are interrelated, and there is always design a feedback loop. So just thinking that FMEA is a starting point somehow may make you believe that I have done all I could on the FMEA side. Now it's all on the controls. So I'd like you to think about a box like FMEA, control plan, and put a loop back to FMEA. You will learn a lot as you execute your control plan that maybe you didn't consider while you're doing an FMEA. And I would like you to think about the relationship between your design FMEAs and process FMEAs and use FMEAs and software FMEAs, not as isolated documents, because even though ISO 14971 tells you what priority to use for risk controls, they want you to do things by design first. Absolutely. Not everything is possible. Even if it's possible, may not be a smart idea from a business point of view, right? Remember, if we don't produce product, it's irrelevant. We are not saving patients' lives if we don't have products. So don't over-design it. Don't make it so expensive that nobody can use it or afford it. That's why rely on other mechanisms. And ISO 14971 tells you, sure, focus on design, but you could also put, additional indications or controls through your design process or manufacturing process. And finally, you could do through warnings and labels, instructions for use. It's not either or, it's all linked. And I like us to kind of think about a systems engineering perspective. How can I optimize everything by making sure that I'm following this priority, but I also am designing risk control? So to your point, Veronica, long story short, you will learn a lot as you begin to implement your control plans. to say, hey, maybe to implement this control, I have to do a lot of engineering, or I have to do a lot of inspection. I have to do a lot of QC, and it's going to be an ongoing cost on me. What else can I do? And maybe if it's not, remember, the priority is only because of effectiveness factor, right? They are saying that if you do by design, it's most effective. If you do by process or alarms or some indications, less effective. If you do only by instructions for use or safety, least effective. It is still effective. And if something is less effective, maybe, and it's critical, maybe you do a check, and maybe you implement some redundancy, right? So there are many ways to deal with this, and I would like us to kind of think about a feedback loop from our control plans as we execute to say, what should I now recognize in my FMEA that I didn't do before, and maybe delegate it to another FMEA? Something like that. You could begin to think that way. So I like us to really step out of this this mindset of doing things in blocks and thinking holistically as a system. Does that make sense, Veronica, or did I kind of again lead you to a totally confusing direction?
No, that makes sense. Definitely.
Yeah, and that will force you to evaluate your FMEAs and control plans on a periodic basis. Right? And you could ask the question to the engineers, hey, could we do it a little bit differently? And if we are worried about effectiveness, what else should I do? Right? You want to reduce the risk to whatever your acceptability criteria is. Right? You guys must have heard about as far as possible, right? As low as reasonably practical, things like that. Whatever your policy is, you need to bring it down to that level and continue doing it lower, but not necessarily, if it makes sense. We have to make trade-offs all the time, and that's the engineer in me talking. The doctors will challenge you and say, no, you know what? I'm still worried that people will make mistakes in the field. I'm not going to rely on just warnings and labels. I'm still worried people are going to make mistakes. A very, very good point. What else, guys? Again, I like in these discussions, I like us to think a little bit broadly instead of going into prescriptive solutions. What I would recommend is that you could certainly schedule more time with me one-on-one if you would like to talk more prescriptive and more specific to your situation. So I hope you will understand that, and I hope it'll still be of value to you. Okay, what else?
Do you think that ATA CCP is a good tool to control risks in the manufacturing process? Hazard analysis and critical control point?
Yes. If it's applicable to you, yes. So in ISO TR 24971, you can look up all the different tools that they describe. You can pick one or more, whichever you think is most relevant, and what the engineers in your organizations are already used to using. I would lean that way. I try not to go into those discussions by saying this tool is better than other. What I try to say is, when people engage with me and say, tell me what you're doing today and how I can help you make it better. I don't want people to start using a new tool. So if you're using CCP, if you're using HAZOPs, if you're using FMEAs, continue using those, because you can integrate elements of other tools into the tool you're using already. Does that make sense? And call it your own, just give it your own name. That's how I like to help people solve problems. Good question. Good questions, guys. Keep it up.
Naveen, quick question, or maybe not a quick question, but so, my objective in being in the startup world is obviously trying to get product to market. And you had discussed that briefly. And so, the whole hazard analysis, risk management can be a bit overwhelming for a startup and could lead us down a rabbit hole. So the approach I've kind of taken is, and tell me if this is right or wrong, but looking at hazards instead of doing an FMEA type of analysis, which I'm not really, I'm an engineer by training, but not really qualified to do that. I kind of look at it from the perspective of foreseeable events that can lead to a hazardous situation, and kind of look at it in that way. So just kind of going through, in my mind, all the potential things that could occur in the situations that could occur that lead to a hazardous situation, and then assigning a probability of the likelihood of that event, that sequence of events occurring and causing that situation, and separate that from the hazardous situation causing the harm. Is that an okay way to approach this and just avoid the FMEA analysis?
I would answer your question this way, Ward. If I understand the startup scenario, right? The question to ask is, for a startup or any other business, how much value do you place on saving, let's say, a week of regulatory approval time or going to market early? How much value do you put on that? Because I'll tell you, FDA, based on my understanding, is very, very open to the conversation of the right balance between pre-market risk controls and post-market risk controls. Very open. But they will not listen to you unless you can convince them that you have done a very rigorous hazard analysis, that you know more than anybody else in the world about that product, about the kind of hazardous situations and harms that may result. Okay, that's number one. So I would not cut corners on hazard analysis. I would overkill it. Then you have a decision to make. How many of those hazards do you want to control pre-market versus post-market? That's the trade-off. Then you can say to FDA, given the benefit risk assessment I have done, I'm going to choose to control only this space pre-market, with a plan to monitor post-market and do additional work if you let me go out there, because the benefit is so big. If I force my patients to wait another year without this product, their life will be miserable, if that's the case. So the answer is benefit risk. If the benefit is high, typically risk is high also. If the benefit is low, typically the risk is expected to be lower. There'll always be risk, but FDA will not be very open to you if you haven't controlled all the risks that they know should be controlled if the benefit is low. The benefit is high, they're going to let you say, yeah, fine, do only this much pre-market. And for that, whether you use FMEA or do some other analysis, it doesn't matter what you use. But if you show them, here are my risks, this is how I've controlled pre-market, I know I have unmitigated, uncontrolled risks, and I know I'm going in, but I ask your approval because benefit is so high. But here's my plan. Without them telling you, do a post-market study. Imagine if you went to FDA with that, wouldn't that be a better conversation and reduce the review timeline?
Yeah. Okay.
So if you are advising startups, I would advise them not from the point of view the amount of work it takes, but the decision they should make, striking the right balance between pre-market and post-market. That's how I would frame that question.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Anything else, guys? Keep it up. This is good discussion. Anything else on your mind?
How do you manage risks in a project change control?
Excellent question. So it's expected that you will evaluate every change or every proposed change for its impact on risk. And risks are many different types of risks. ISO 14971 focuses on risk of harm. But the change could be an administrative change, could be a process change, right? That may relate to the immediate process. Maybe it affects the quality of the product, not necessarily the safety of the product. Mm-hmm. You should still evaluate all those changes. It would make sense for your change control to evaluate holistically, not just for ISO 14971. 13485 also applies. So evaluate holistically, and you might develop your own template or your own questionnaire, your own review process. But two things, typically people don't like to see considerations of cost in that. In my mind, it's a relevant business question. If the cost is too high, why do the change, right? But it's a relevant question, but typically what people like to see is your consideration for different types of risks to patients first. But you should also evaluate the risks to your operations. How about risks to your own employees? Do you ever consider that? Like when you do change, like, are you going to ask them to do stuff that may require them, or may put them into some situations of unsafe acts without knowing? So think about that. So risks to your own employees, your own operations. So when you do change, typically I've seen change controls very driven mostly by compliance. They want like a checkbox. And I'll be honest with you, that's not it becomes more like an administrative bureaucratic activity, and engineers hate it, right? As an engineer, I would hate something like that. So make something that works for you and creates effective changes. And changes, it's important because if your change, by the way, you bring a good point. If your change process is efficient and effective, actually you will win in the marketplace because our world is changing constantly, right? But if your change process is so difficult and mostly compliance activity, you will be stuck. Yeah. So I want us to kind of think again a little bit broadly and help out. So the reason I talk to the quality folks like you in this perspective is because I want us to play a bigger role in our organizations. Like we are the champions of quality and customer and patient, but our job is also to help our business succeed. And so we are at the bridge. How can we help them do that? So I like to share very openly my philosophies on how you can help achieve these goals, and not just, like I said, compliance is given. We have to do it. And only we know better than anybody else how to be compliant, right? Having said that, let's be in a position where we say, let me help you achieve what you're trying to achieve while staying compliant, and our business will be competitive. So again, like, stop me anytime, because I like to share this mindset because I want us to kind of think a little bit differently as well. Good question though. Design changes, for example, same thing, right? Design changes should go through the same type of a review process. Is a particular change going to make the design so cumbersome, difficult that it introduce new? What they're worried about is, whatever you're going to do, is it going to introduce something new that you didn't think of, which will be a bigger risk than where you are? At the bottom line, that's the whole point. Don't create new risk, right?
So, Naveen, with that said, if I do go into a situation and I make design changes or I learn something from the field, what is the appropriate way to go back and demonstrate that I have taken into consideration, the potential risks introduced by these design changes? What process should I go through to do that?
Yeah. So if you have, now this is a great tactical question, right? If you have set up the hazard analysis correctly, hopefully you have like a master document that is kind of a roadmap for you. That's your knowledge. This is how much I know, right? If you become aware of, through post-market surveillance, a new harm or new hazardous situation or a new hazard or a new information comes in, and you need to go back to that and say, did I capture it already in one way or another? Or is this so totally new, I really have to, expand my knowledge base now? So that will be your kind of roadmap. And you will make decisions based on the rigorous nature of the hazard analysis you have done, what more you should do, right? I know how business works. A lot of design changes are requested because we expect better productivity. It's a good thing to expect better productivity. It's a good thing to expect lower cost, better way of doing things, right? That will not appear in a hazard analysis. But what might happen is that as you begin to learn about that proposed change or a design change or a new way of doing things, you will begin to think, am I going to touch upon a new hazard that I didn't capture here? You will go back to that. So both post-market changes, force changes on you, or internal changes through business strategy and new projects, you will always go back to your hazard analysis and ask the question, is there anything new here that I didn't think about before? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And so does that hazard analysis then, do I expand on, let's say I have a matrix created, do I expand on that, or do I start from scratch and create a whole new one?
No, you expand on that. And in fact, once you build it, you use that as a starting point for any new product you are going to launch. Unless that new product is so fundamentally different, you don't know anything about it, which is highly unlikely. Because hazard analysis is driven by the patient perspective. So you will actually, that will become a resource, an asset for you, because you will continue to build that. And I have helped people use that as a foundation or a starting point for a preliminary hazard analysis for a new product. You don't have to reinvent it.
Got it.
But you got to have a mechanism to consistently review and update through post-market and through pre-market changes that are going. So, Christine, to your point, in your change control process, it'll be smart to have a line item. Have you reviewed the hazard analysis and any new changes are required?
Okay.
It'll be smart to have that.
And any new, if I have to go back to my hazard analysis due to a change, and I have to rewrite the report, to update the report.
Tell me a little bit more about which report you are thinking about.
The final report. Once I have implement all the controls, then I have to write to elaborate a report.
Yeah. So typically you would have to go and update your risk management file. Like part of that would be your risk management report updates, your risk assessment updates. Hazard analysis is only one component of your risk management file. You may have to update design history file as well, depending upon the nature of the change. So yes, if you'll have to keep in mind how many documents are going to be affected, and that's a regulatory compliance issue. So make sure you have a good map of all the different records that you'll have to update. But yes, it will be expected that somehow, once you have implemented the change, how do you show that as part of your risk management file? And you may have other regulatory requirements, for example, clinical evaluation reports to be filed every year, right?
Yeah.
You may have to submit a new PMS supplement or a 510K. So always talk to your regulatory folks, what else will need to be updated? Yes, it will probably be associated with a lot of updates to the documents.
Do you think that I have to do a new benefit risk analysis?
If it is applicable, indeed, yes. It might actually be helpful, because otherwise, why are you doing the change? Either to increase the benefit or lower the risk. And if you can demonstrate that, not necessarily in a quantitative way, you don't have to do that, but develop a framework for different benefit risk analysis factors, and you can rate them on a scale of 1 to 5, and you can say, before the change, I was in a, just like you do severity POH table for acceptability, you could say I have a benefit risk table, and before the change I was here, after the change I'm here. It's a great evidence to show why you did the change and what data you have to back up against that claim, and it could drive some smart decision making. We came up with a new tool, guys. We came up with a new matrix for benefit risk. You have to show where you are and where you are going. And if you are going to land in a space which is, minor improvement in benefit, why do it? It's too much work. So you may have some criteria about project approval, right? Not everything is in terms of dollars, but you could have in design phase, you could have, I'm thinking out loud here, is that you could say, why do this project? Because benefit risk, we are here today with other options that exist in the marketplace. With our product, we are going to be much better. We're going to be in a different space. That's why we must do it. And as you do more work, you discover more risks, more work to be done, constantly evaluate what is my benefit risk. So having an ISO 14971 doesn't tell you how to do it, but I think that's where they are going. They're going for you to begin to think about how you will make business decisions driven by benefit risk. Good question. Good question. Guys, we are almost running against the clock here. Any last minute questions? Because I do have something I want to share with you. No? Okay.
Hi.
So, yes, go ahead. Go ahead, please.
Yeah. So I just wanted to know how much it is important to collect the data and represent the data of predicate for any clinical evaluation data of your predicates, like clinical trials data.
So that's Kanchan, right?
Yes.
Okay. It's a great question. I think it's more of a regulatory strategy question than anything else. How much depends upon what you are trying to achieve and what is the kind of bar ahead of you, right? What kind of product you have, what kind of predicate you are looking at. So how much is the question about what is required for you to demonstrate clinically the benefit while also showing that the risks are acceptable. That's how I would frame in a risk management context. So the reason why they are asking you to generate data against the predicate device is they're going to make a determination, should I even clear or approve this product based on the data that has been given to me? Your regulatory people should be asking that question right away. Say, do you have enough? Is a regulator, will they be convinced that now you have demonstrated enough of a benefit risk? Now they're worried about clinical benefit only, okay? They're not worried about any other benefit. Show me clinically that the benefit of this device compared to the predicate is superior given the risks, or benefit about the same, but the risks are significantly better. That's another criteria by which you can get clearance or approval. So I cannot give you how much as a clear answer, but that's how you should be thinking about is how can I answer that question from a regulator? Good question.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. So I do want you guys to do like okay, it looks like we're not going to be able to do that. So anyway, I wanted to get your opinion about hazard analysis. Why do hazard analysis? Okay. We'll talk about that. But what I want to introduce to you is a workshop that I offer on how to do preliminary hazard analysis. It's a 3-hour hands-on workshop. And the next one is coming next week. Okay, so I've done it a couple of times in the past. In that workshop, that's a great forum to have a very specific discussion about how am I going to link underlying documents. But my main focus in that workshop is to help you understand hazards, hazardous situations, and harms. And I offer you a template that you can use through hands-on activities. So if you guys are interested, I can send you a link. Take a look at it. If you're interested or have any questions, just let me know. You can also go to my website and check under workshops. And apart from that, the only other announcement I wanted to share with you was we will have this again next month. So keep an eye open on that. Well, you're welcome to join. Don't be a stranger. Right? Come back with your questions. My intention here is to discuss and have you and propose to you some new ideas and thoughts that you can take with you. But if you have specific questions, feel free to reach out and even request a one-on-one. I'll be very happy to do that with you. So any last minute questions, comments, thoughts, any feedback from you? Is this an hour well spent for you, or would you like to do something different on a Friday?
That's very valuable. It's good to see everybody having similar problems. So that's nice.
We are all in it together. And the way I look at this is somewhere I read it, that we cannot solve our current problems with the solutions of yesterday or something like that. Or if you keep doing the same thing over and over again, it's insanity. We have to do things different. And that's my approach in these conversations with you. So I want to set your expectations that in these conversations, you're not going to get like a checkbox type of an answer from me. I'll resist doing that. But I want us to kind of think a little bit broadly. That's why I'm doing it.
I think it's a really excellent reminder to think broadly. So yeah. I think you get so focused and you kind of go along. And so it's really nice to hear that, to just remind yourself to look at it broadly.
And I'm totally convinced that along the way, we'll find a way to solve the problems in our world. I know that. In your jobs, you will find a way to solve your immediate problems. But if you have this broader view, you will actually help them accomplish more goals than just fix an FMEA or just fix a hazard analysis or just address an audit finding, right? Okay, right at 11 o'clock. So anything else on your mind? Last minute, last call.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a nice weekend.
Appreciate it. Take care.
You too, guys. Hopefully.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep.
Very
Have a
helpful.
good weekend, guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.